You're listening to an IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education. Powered by UCL Minds.
Hello and a very warm welcome. Thanks for joining us for this virtual event on GCSEs. I'm Mary Richardson. I'm an Associate Professor for Educational Assessment at UCL Institute of Education, and I'm really pleased to be chairing this very exciting and timely debate tonight. So we'll be reviewing that ongoing debate about the value of the GCSE system in England, and that's been under scrutiny, obviously, for many years amongst participants in the assessment domain. But I think it's been particularly magnified in the last couple of years. And we're all waiting to see what is going to happen in 2021 during this exam cycle. We have, of course, an esteemed panel to help us reflect on the issues tonight, and I'll introduce them in a moment. But just to let you know how the event will run this evening, as usual, it's being recorded now, and it will be posted online on the UCL website after we've finished. Once we've taken some opening statements from the panellists, they've got just 5 minutes each. We'll then move on to your many questions and comments, which are already rolling in. Please do use the Q&A feature on Slido for this and share your views on what you're hearing too, and you might want to pose other questions to the speakers. And I'll try and get through as many as we can this evening. You can, of course, also tweet about the event. We really encourage you to do so. If you do that, please use the hashtag IOE debates. So back to the panel. So I'll introduce our 4 speakers. First, we have Tina Isaacs. Tina is an Honorary Associate Professor in Educational Assessment at the IOE. Having started her career at the National Centre on Education and the Economy in Rochester, New York, Tina then moved to England and spent 15 years working for NCVQ, for what was the QCA, and also for Ofqual. And primarily her work was in the field of 14 to 19 qualifications, and of course that includes the GCSEs. Tina moved to the IOE in 2009, where her research has covered educational assessment, education policy, politics, qualifications development, accreditation, and regulation. Our second speaker tonight is Tim Oates. Tim is the Group Director of the Assessment, Research and Development at Cambridge Assessment. Tim's career has spanned research and development roles in higher education, national qualifications agencies and the exam boards, throughout which he has regularly provided policy to the UK and other governments. In 2011, Tim chaired the expert panel for the review of the national curriculum in England, and his subsequent research on the quality and function of textbooks has been taken up all over the world. Tim received a CBE for his services to education in 2015. Our third speaker tonight is Dennis Sherwood. Dennis trained as a scientist, and his career has spanned academia and management consultancy, including being a consulting partner with Deloitte and the UK Managing Director with SRI International. In 2001, Dennis founded his own consulting business, Silver Bullet, and he specialises in organisational innovation and creativity. In recent years, he's been studying the unreliability of school exam grades and campaigning to make them reliable and trustworthy. And our fourth speaker tonight is Jill Winus. Jill is an Associate Professor of Economics within the IOE Centre for Education Policy and Equalising Opportunities. She is also a Research Associate at the Centre for Economic Performance at the London School of Economics. Jill's main research area is the economics of tertiary education, and she's particularly interested in inequalities in university participation and attainment, the drivers of that, including the school factors. So you can see what an interesting panel we have tonight. And without further ado, I'm going to hand back to them. And first up is Tina Isaacs. Thank you, Tina.
Hello. So I'm using the privilege of going first as a way of both introducing the debate and also then honing in on my own opinions about what goes on for our 14 to 16-year-olds. As far as the GCSE goes, I revert to my friend Gordon Stobart's 3 questions that you have to ask of any assessment. What is the assessment's purpose? Is it structured in a way to achieve that purpose? And then the important one, does it achieve its purpose? Well, for GCSEs, as I'm sure you all know, there is actually no one purpose. It serves multiple purposes. And that causes some people consternation. Some people are fine with it. For me, there are 3 main purposes. You would hope there'd only be one, but it seems to me that there are 3. One is to let us know something about a child's achievement in subjects. Another, to allow students to progress to further studies, not necessarily A levels, but to progress. And lastly, accountability for schools and teachers. And to my mind, the accountability purpose has predominated at the expense of the other purposes. And that it seems to me that that has become, well, I'm going to say worse and worse, but certainly greater and greater in the last few years, last year notwithstanding, because of COVID. And I think that the accountability purpose undermines the curricular purpose, which is the one I believe is the most important one, the achievement purpose, and distorts the progression purpose. So what is the achievement purpose? It's that old chestnut, understanding what students know and are able to do. We all say this all the time, but it's understanding deeply what students have mastered. And I emphasize the deeply for the achievement purpose. For the progression purpose, obviously you want to be able to gauge where students are, whether they can progress, what they should progress onto. But it seems to me that you should know not just what they know and are able to do, but what they need to do in order to get on well in the future. That is, how to continue to work further on and to give them some insight into how they could fill the gaps. This is all well known to anybody who has studied feedback, and the kind of feedback you should get from assessment. Now, our students' future progression depends almost entirely on their performance in their assessments in upper secondary. We all know this. And for us, the GCSEs are do or die. The way I characterize them is gotcha assessments, where the outcomes are entirely based on one set of exams. So I think it's bad assessment practice to put all your eggs in one basket, and that the fullest picture of a student's achievement would come from multiple sources of evidence over the course of the entire course. So I see that I'm talking more than I thought I was going to, so I'm going to skip around a little bit and offer a bit of an alternative to this end all be all gotcha. And what I would like to propose is that we actually introduce something that I'm calling GCSE Light. So I understand that for accountability purposes, we might want to know where students are in subjects, but I would argue that if we introduce a set of tests, and I'm calling them tests rather than exams, in at least English and mathematics, I could be persuaded to introduce them in science. All of those have programs of study for which that are mandatory. I could actually extend it to EBAC subjects as well. I'll get to that in a second. The test could be developed by an independent agency, similar to the Standards and Testing Agency that operates now, free from government interference. To tie in with what Tim will surely introduce as the Cambridge Principles for the Future of Education, I would argue that for the curriculum purpose, for the achievement purpose, that we should make EBAC subjects compulsory for all students to the age of 16 to make them good, responsible, and competent citizens. But you would have fewer tests. I would also argue that they don't necessarily need to be at age 16. If you're going to test more than just English and mathematics. They should be by 18, now that our students are staying on in school, college, or some form of education until 18. So I'd like to see testing English, mathematics, and science not at age 16, but the remaining tests taken by 18, and for other subjects to be completely internally assessed. I'm going to finish off with my most radical proposal, which no one ever seems to like, which I think the ideal mix of the achievement, progression, and accountability purposes would be to have the outcomes based on 60% examination, 25% on coursework, and here's the real kicker, 15% unalloyed teacher judgment, that is judgment over the progress of a course. There are ITT and CPD implications, obviously, but it wasn't so long ago that we accepted the coursework was just fine. And I see this as a way of reintroducing the professional stature for teachers. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tina. So straight on, I'd like to introduce Tim Oates. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks very much, Tina. There are quite a few things that I want to pick up from what you've said, points with which I agree in terms of what we should take into account in terms of the development of future policy in the assessment space. But I also want the debate to be held with really good understanding of the international evidence, the history, and evidence on where we are. I'll be brief. I'll try and stick to the 5 minutes. You mentioned the principles, actually, that we're working on in Cambridge. I probably won't go through those in detail. There are 14 of them. They're on our website, but I will touch on some of them. So, first of all, I just want to spend a couple of seconds talking about what we're in at the moment. I mean, we're going through an unprecedented disruption of education and society and the economy, for which we were not well prepared, which is understandable. I mean, if our education system had been well prepared for the kind of disruption that we've experienced, it would have been running with massive redundancy. And the fact is that most developed systems are running quite lean currently, and they're not well set up for dealing with an unanticipated disruption of this kind. This has caused an awful lot of wobbling and an awful lot of shouting. And some of the things that are being said are factually incorrect. They're not in line with domestic and international evidence. And also it's kind of sanctioned people to say things that they wanted to say for a long time, which aren't necessarily linked to dealing with this question of how should we refine the assessment that we have in compulsory schooling. If you scratch beneath the surface of some of the things that people are saying, to get to the underlying rationale, you find some very, very contrary things and contradictory things. You know, some people actually are really interested in getting rid of GCSE, let's use that language for the moment, because they're interested in transfer at 14. Others are interested in quite radical curriculum priorities, quite unproven actually, about how we should transform what we should focus on in education. Very controversial, not much evidence for some of the things being said. Some are interested in liberating the market in assessment. Actually, what they want to do is heavily marketize assessment and bring in new forms of assessment from independent technology providers. Others are actually have got accountability in their sights, and the one way that they feel that they can remove the current accountability arrangements and their effect on schools is to get rid of the exams, which play such a significant part in them. So as the debate unfolds, make sure you scratch beneath the surface of what's being said to the underpinning rationale. I spend a lot of time with schools, colleges, parents and pupils, and actually at the moment in discussion, there's not much call at that level for getting rid of GCSEs. They're far more concerned about access, about equity, about attainment, about progression and so on, and I think quite rightly so. Support highly qualified teachers and so on. I'm worried about fairness and lack of bias in assessment, and Dennis will talk cogently about how we can improve GCSE and A-levels and public assessment to make the grades that we derive from them and the report we have from them more dependable. I mean, A-levels came in 1952, GCSEs in 1986. Don't forget they've changed adable recognition during that time. They've been constantly refined and changed, different balance of modes of assessment, at some occasions moving to the kind of balance of modes that Tina was talking about. Must think about the purpose of GCSEs. They structure learning programs in terms of content. They provide allied learning materials and resources. They provide curriculum coherence, assessment tied to content, staff development, independent assessment, ongoing assessment, motivation to learn amongst pupils, and data on performance and quality. Now, we can misuse those data, and that was something which Tina referred to. In the debate, people have said we're an outlier. No other nation has high stakes assessment at 16. Not true, simply not true. In 2015, Jill Elliott and Nikki Rushton did a report from Cambridge. I've updated it with Arenka Suto for the year, just to make sure we're absolutely right. We looked at high performing systems. We didn't choose those that had exams. We identified the highest performing systems, and of those high performing systems, all of them have high stakes assessment at 16. Of those 19 countries that we looked at, the highest performing systems, 2/3 have external assessments at the age of 16. So we just want to get those facts established. Not the high number of subjects that we do in some cases, but they all have high stakes assessment, 2/3 external assessment. Some, Estonia and Singapore, use those in accountability arrangements. Now, this is not, I'm just putting those down as facts at the moment. We'll come on to what my views are of what we should do in the future. Should GCSEs change? They undoubtedly will, and we should change them. We should make them more resilient in terms of dealing with the kind of pressures that we've seen during pandemic. We should, as Tina says, use the data that they produce and the report of student attainment that they produce sensibly, ethically, functionally, and we can discuss that. I'll really finish on one key thing. People have looked at GCSE, but they've forgotten that GCSE is the end of general education, that we then have specialist education for 2 years, and that allows us to have 3-year degrees. I mean, if we change all of that and make general education much longer, we'll probably need 4-year degrees. Fine if we agree to do that, but of course at the moment that's paid for by families. So I just want people to understand the implications of a system where you change something here, and usually it has some knock-on effect to the shape of the system as a whole. Thank you very much, Mary.
Thank you, Tim. Okay, we're straight on to our next speaker, who's Dennis Sherwood. Thanks, Dennis.
Hi, Mary. Thank you, and good evening, everyone. Thank you, Tim, for the feed forward, and thank you to Tina for giving me a great opening. Tina, you mentioned the metaphor of eggs in baskets and mentioned that that's not a good thing. For the basket labelled GCSE, even worse, when the basket has holes in it, the eggs fall through and get badly broken, because I'd like to argue that that's what happens right now. And I'd like to introduce a word that we haven't used much so far: trust. Can we trust GCSE grades? So the young person doing GCSE history and is awarded a grade 5, is that grade trustworthy? Now, you might think that's a very silly question. The grade is awarded by a system that has been running for decades. Millions of grades have been awarded. They're administered by professionals, such as the exam boards, and overseen by the regulator Ofqual. Of course, they're trustworthy. But how do you know? In other contexts, you refer to a second opinion. In medicine, for example, or in the law. So maybe our young history student might be able to appeal to get that script remarked, just to see if there's a possibility that maybe the script deserved a grade 6, because we all know different examiners can give slightly different marks to the same question. Now, it turns out that since 2016, such an appeal has been disallowed. You can indeed appeal GCSE grades now, but the grounds are very narrow, and you cannot appeal seeking a remark. So for the last several years, young people have been awarded their grades and they've been obliged to trust them. They've been denied that second opinion. But it turns out things aren't quite so bad, because there's a really good source of second opinion information Ofqual's own research. For in the mid-2010s, Ofqual carried out a significant programme where 14 subjects, the entire cohorts, were double marked. So for history or geography or economics, the scripts were marked once by an ordinary examiner, so-called, which corresponded to the original marking process. And then all the scripts were marked a second time by a senior examiner whose mark was designated definitive or indeed true. That meant that you had literally hundreds of thousands of scripts for which that second opinion comparison could be made. And you might be thought that there would be just a few discrepancies in that research. People make mistakes after all. And you might also have thought that any discrepancies would have been evenly or randomly distributed over subjects, because there's no particular reason, for example, that an examiner in economics might be any more negligent or indeed more conscientious than an examiner in, say, geography. Well, it turns out that there are two key results of that Ofqual research, which might be a bit surprising. The discrepancies vary significantly by subject, and the discrepancies are much bigger numbers than you might have thought. 4 scripts in 100 in maths had discrepancies, around 35 in geography, around 45, 44 in history. So that means that those history scripts, if an entire cohort were remarked, about half would have their marks changed. For the cohort overall, it's about 25%. Now, this was acknowledged by Dame Glenys Stacey, the chief regulator at Ofqual, at a select committee hearing. She acknowledged that about 1 grade in 4 is wrong. Her words were, grades are reliable to 1 grade either way. They're the same statement. So in conclusion, today's first exam question was, is the GCE system intrinsically flawed? Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I submit to you that Ofqual's acknowledgement that grades are reliable to 1 grade either way is not only a smoking gun, but cast iron evidence that the current system is not just intrinsically flawed, but fatally so.
Thank you very much, Dennis. And to our fourth speaker now, please. I'll hand over to Jill Winus. Thanks, Jill.
Thanks, Mary. So thanks very much for having me, and good evening, everyone. So I think there's 2 questions here. Firstly, do we need to assess students at age 16 now that the education participation age is raised to 18? And secondly, if we agree that we do need some form of assessment at age 16, is the GCSE the right form of assessment? So on the first question, I think we do need to assess students at age 16. Students split into very different pathways at age 16. Many will follow the traditional route of going from GCSE to A-level to university. If we abolish GCSEs or exams at 16, students who follow those traditional pathways, they'll go on to get A-levels and a degree, and everyone will recognise that set of qualifications. But others won't go that traditional route. They'll go on to further education, or they'll do an apprenticeship or technical qualifications. Those can be quite narrow qualifications. So if those students then decide they want to change paths later on, it would be quite hard for employers or education providers to know how they've done across a core set of subjects. And then there's the students who don't attain any further qualifications beyond GCSEs. So Ruth Lupton's recent work shows that around 25% of the lowest attainers end up leaving with nothing higher than GCSEs. So for those who leave without any, if we abolish GCSEs, those students will have no marker of school performance at all. So I think GCSEs serve as a really useful benchmark and externally marked standardized qualification that all students from all backgrounds will have. So I do think, in answer to the first question, we do need to have some kind of standardized assessment at age 16. But on the second question, I'm interested in this very much from an equity point of view. And I think that having an exam that's externally set and externally marked, that has the least chance of bias. If we consider alternative forms of assessment that have been, mooted recently, we know that there's real dangers of them being less equitable. So the most obvious alternative to the GCSE and to exams is to just have some form of teacher assessment. I mean, indeed, that's how we're going to assess students this year in the absence of exams. But teacher assessment can be unreliable. There's a whole body of work that highlights biases in teacher-based assessment. For example, there's a 2013 paper by Simon Burgess and Ellen Greaves of Bristol, and it's a very important study in which the authors were able to exploit different ways that we assess pupils at Key Stage 2. So at age 11, pupils are assessed in two different ways: by written exam, nationally set and externally marked, just like the GCSE, and by assessment by the pupil's own teacher. And Burgess and Greaves found that they found statistically and quantitatively significant differences in these forms of assessment across different groups of students. For example, Black Caribbean students were more likely to receive a grade from their teacher that was below their final test score than white pupils were. And the same was true for pupils from poorer backgrounds. Their teacher assessments were lower than their exam grades. And that was a very robust study. It used administrative data, it compared students even within the same schools with the same background characteristics. And there are many other robust papers out there that show biases in teacher assessment in favor of certain groups. And my own work examines teacher prediction accuracy for A-levels, and I think that also speaks to the wider debate about teacher assessments. My work on predicted grades shows that teacher predictions are very unreliable. They're often vastly overinflated, and they can tend to favour certain groups. And I emphasise that this isn't the teacher's fault. My work with co-authors at CPO has shown that it's very difficult to predict the grades of certain students, especially those from poorer backgrounds, who tend to have trajectories that are more volatile and harder to predict. So, asking teachers to assess students in a fair and unbiased manner that's comparable across settings is an impossible task. And it also puts a great burden onto teachers. Another alternative that we talk about is to just have coursework instead of exams. But we know, that it's much easier for parents to interfere in coursework. They can afford tutors, they can help their kids with their work. There's always a risk with these forms of assessment that they'll favour those with better educated parents from better off backgrounds. And a final point I wanted to make here is that we should listen to young people's voices on this issue. So at CPO, we've actually surveyed recently a representative group of young people to ask them whether they would have preferred to sit the exams or to have gone with teacher assessment last year. And among those that expressed a preference, the majority said, I'd rather sit the exam. So in summary, I argue that we do need a standardized assessment at age 16. It should be externally set and externally marked, and that would be the most rigorous and the fairest option for all students.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. And thank you all for keeping it brief too, because obviously the questions and I'm sure lots of other kind of comments and thoughts will be coming in here. I'm not being rude and texting randomly. I'm dealing with questions as they're coming in from you are popping up on my phone. So I'm going to field them from here. So I think one of the questions that's come up that I would put to the panel first of all are the idea of assessments being used for multiple purposes. And a few people have asked this question about, for example, are GCSEs really a useful predictor of student performance going on to A-level, even though obviously that's not necessarily their original purpose, but as Tim said, assessments change over time. We would expect that. Sorry, that's the main question. Let's start with that one, the actual purpose to which GCSEs are put. Do you think it's, I think basically what this person's trying to ask is, do you think it's time that we actually reevaluated and talked about what their purpose is? Is there a need for that conversation in a more public setting? Yeah. I'll start with Tina.
So I do think that the multiple purposes for which the GCSE is put place too heavy a burden on that examination. I would very much like to see accountability, the accountability purpose lessened. I'm not arguing against accountability, absolutely not. We need to know that students are getting as fair a shake in London as they are in Loughborough. But I think that by burdening something that for me should be about curriculum performance and should be about something that can predict your future. And by the way, GCSEs are halfway decent predictors of at least of A-level performance. Whether they're good predictors of vocational performance is a different question. But I would like to see much more emphasis on the purposes of curriculum and progression.
Thanks, Tina. Tim?
Thanks. Yeah, I'd echo what Tina said. I think I attend quite a lot of conferences where people use the some of the research on the purposes of examinations rather unwisely, and kind of infer that any one assessment should only have one purpose. I mean, that's very naive. So in Iceland recently, they introduced a new reading test. It's a national test. Wait for it, it's termly. It's a termly national test of reading. And the teachers love it, the parents love it, and the state uses the outcomes for looking at the overall standards of reading in the nation. And the test is used to support individual kids in improving their reading and to identify kids that are at risk of falling behind. Yeah, and everybody's happy with the test. It's got multiple purposes and it works really well. So it's naive to say that one assessment should only have, an assessment should only have one purpose. I've never found one with a single purpose in education. But the point is they have to be in balance and they have to be ethically and technically grounded. And Dennis has rightly pointed out over-interpretation of some of the outcomes in terms of grades, and we could report GCSEs differently. Tina has emphasized the extent to which the consequences of achieving a particular grade are quite grave for individuals in terms of progression and for schools in terms of actions taken in relationship to the grades that the school is deriving. And those things should be kept under constant review and should be a subject of constant social debate. And also the functions of qualifications shouldn't be implicit. They should be overt and evaluated and discussed. So I think that openness and transparency in technical evaluation is critical.
Thanks, Tim. Dennis?
Yes, thank you. Two quick points, if I may. I'm not in the education business. I'm an outsider. It's very gracious of you to invite me along. But my world has been sort of management and business. Now, in that world, everyone knows that it's very, very upsetting and muddling if you have performance measures which attempt to measure several things simultaneously, because it leads to all sorts of conflict. So as a matter of best practice, having any performance measure, percentage A to C's or whatever it might be, which performs multiple purposes, is bound to get you into trouble somewhere. Now, I'm not saying it's easy to unravel all of that, but to design that in is asking for trouble. Secondly, predictions. I get nervous about predictions when the measurements at each end are unreliable. So let's imagine that GCSE candidate with the grade 5 who really merited a 7. But that 5 sets the wrong expectation in the teacher. Maybe it depresses the self-confidence of the student and everything unravels from there. So in saying X is a good predictor of Y, there is a general assumption that X is itself a reliable measure, as is Y. They just aren't. So be very careful about how one interprets those correlations. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for that, Dennis. And Jill, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think I really agree with what Tim is saying. Like, I think it is inevitable that that exams will have multiple purposes, and I think that the alternative seems to be that we would have some exams that measure student performance and some that are used for accountability purposes and some that are used for other purposes. Like I think that wouldn't be the ideal situation to be in either. And so I do think it's inevitable that exams are going to be used for accountability, and I think accountability is really, really important. And so if we're in a world where we're going to use some kind of exams or tests for accountability purposes, then they should be externally marked and as unbiased as possible. And I think the GCSE, at least we've developed a system that is externally marked and is an attempt to be as unbiased as possible in that domain.
Thanks, Jill. I notice Dennis has popped his hand up again.
Just one other comment. Yes, I'm an outsider, so I have the benefit of profound ignorance, but I do get worried about statements like inevitable. What is inevitable? Where does imagination and a bit of creativity come in? I find inevitability, a statement of despair. Let's be a bit imaginative about how to solve problems like that. That's it.
Thanks, Dennis. I'm going to take actually Chair's prerogative for a moment as the other questions come in, but I'm really interested because Dennis used the word trust earlier. Now, I'm not sure about whether trust is what we need in test results and in the assessment system itself. I'm wondering if it's more about public confidence, and isn't it, I agree with you, Dennis, on the inevitability. I don't think that there has to be any inevitability in what we do. I think, isn't there now a need, particularly given what happened last year with COVID and what we're facing this year, to think about how we actually educate teachers as professional assessors too, as a part of their role? Because it often surprises me as someone who teaches people about assessment, how little understanding there is out there. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. I'll start with Tim.
Thanks. And I'd like to add to what Jill's been saying, the kind of cumulative view of teacher assessment, by just briefly mentioning Sweden. So there's a really good, the IVA report, Henriksson report from Sweden, looks at the PISA data, and what they find is with a complete dependence on teacher assessment, and in the absence of the kind of professional development you're talking about, what they've seen is unfettered grade inflation. And that would be serious enough. But actually underneath that, there's been a decline of educational standards. So the two things have gone hand in hand, and that's really serious. Now, there's a lot else that's going on in Sweden, the voucher system, the nature of competition between schools and so on. But nonetheless, the Swedish government is really examining the issues which domestically, which Jill has outlined, and are looking at the role of external testing and the inclusion of standards, national standards, to try to arrest that really problematic double trajectory of inflation plus decline of standards. Now, Sweden is interesting because they don't feel that the public is ready for the imposition of externality on the scale that's probably required in their mind. And so they're providing national standards to be deployed by teachers. And it's being done in the relative absence of the kind of large-scale professional development that you see in other systems like Singapore. I think many other nations that have really done well in these kind of areas of introducing other elements of assessment have had very high levels of accompanying staff development. And it's not only just about the techniques of assessment, it's also developing a moral understanding of the importance of everybody complying with standards. And I think that moral and technical compunction to actually be consistent is an important part of that professional development.
Thank you. Tina.
So I find myself in the rare situation where I'm agreeing completely with Tim. I think, so one of the reasons why I introduced this sort of mixed basket of eggs, as it were, was that I don't think that we should be relying on one form of evidence. And teacher judgment is subject to bias. Of course, in exams, the socioeconomic outcomes of exams is also not what you would hope it would be. But regardless, I think that if we had a mix, with the kinds of professional development that you see in places like Singapore, where people have a huge amount of time of their working day dedicated to professional development, and they work together, they create lessons together, you can improve teacher judgment. It would help to also give them much more training in their initial teacher training on assessment. There's almost none. I know this from the Institute. So for me, I just don't understand why we are talking about either exams or teacher judgment or coursework. It can easily be a mix. Well, maybe I shouldn't use the word easily. With some dedicated work, it could be a mix of the three.
Thanks, Tina. Dennis.
The question of public confidence. Mary, you're absolutely right. The whole system relies on public confidence and trustworthiness of the outcomes. I certainly agree in the mix, as Tina, you were saying. But if we come back to how do teachers learn to be wise assessors, once again, there's a fundamental problem. What is the benchmark of right? So if I'm the history teacher, let's take A-level this time, and I've got 4 history students and I predict them all grade B, it turns out that the actual results they get are A, B, B, C. I rejoice for the A, I grieve for the C, but I think, gosh, I got half of my predictions wrong. And that happens year after year after year. I blame myself. It turns out that half of the A-level results are wrong. Tina, you mentioned the importance of feedback in learning. If that feedback loop is flawed, if the signal coming back from the exam system about what right looks like is wrong, how on earth can a teacher ever learn what a grade A or B looks like? And this is particularly going to be aggravating this summer when we look at the guidelines for distinguishing between a grade 6 and a grade 7 for GCSE whatever. How on earth can a teacher do that when the exam system doesn't even get it right?
Thanks, Dennis. I'll come back to Joe as well, if you want to add anything, Joe.
I mean, I think we could try and improve teachers' ability to assess better, but I think that would be a very difficult task. I mean, it's a very, very difficult job, and I think that teachers really do have enough on their plates as it is. And I think it speaks to the whole debate about predicted grades, etc. We ask teachers every year to predict students' grades, and that's an enormous task. And our work at CPO has shown that that's a really, really difficult task for them to do. It's really hard to predict certain students' grades. As I was saying, students have very, very different trajectories. So if you look at the GCSE results, some of them will stay on the same pathway to their A levels. Some of them will do something completely different and will outperform, etc. And it's very, very difficult to get those predictions right. So I think if we want, we could take teachers out of school and get them to spend hours and hours learning how to assess things, but that's not what their job is. Their job is to teach. We have exam boards that can assess students. So why don't we just use them and take teachers out of the equation altogether?
Okay, thank you. Oh, Tim, yeah.
If I could just add to that, because I think what Jill's saying is right. If you want to increase the teacher's role in highly dependable assessment, then it will require a real transformation of the professional role. Now it does happen because it happens in medical education. But if you look at the wage structure, what you expect people to do, the nature of the enterprise as an educator, it's totally different. There we do have the kind of mix that Tina's been talking about, wide variety of assessment techniques, assessing the same thing over and over and over again because it's so important that somebody understands a technique or a body of knowledge. But it's very, very expensive and it requires a transformation of the professional role. One of the things that we can rely on in terms of evidence is the kind of work that Michael Rice and Ian Abrams did when we had a very large amount of practical assessment in science. And their work is very telling. When we tried to increase the precision of the assessment of practical work, teachers actually hated it. They didn't like it because they felt it was boring, dull, over-constrained, too bureaucratic, wasted time, took time away from learning. And I do think we have to listen to that kind of research, which is done by researchers very anxious to get the education, the reality of education right in their subject areas. It's not good news in respect of increasing the role of teachers in formal assessment.
Okay, thank you all. I'm going to move to a slightly different sort of perspective now. Question, I think this is from Lawrence Brown. What are the wider benefits of losing GCSEs? Could you see any wider benefits of losing GCSEs? And he also asks, what else must we do to affect a more meaningful learning experience in schools for young people for future work? So it's quite a specific idea of the aim of education here. Dennis, have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, I think if the GCSE straitjacket were loosened, so to speak, that must leave opportunities within the curriculum for a broader curriculum. And there are any number of lobby groups now, from Rethinking Assessment to lots of other people, who are talking about introducing broader skill bases like creativity, for example, or teamwork, and just doing things very, very differently. It enables fundamental change in what kids actually do during the school day. I don't think that need diminish the learning, but I think it offers lots and lots of interesting opportunities which need thinking through. Thank you.
Tina?
So this sounds strange coming from an assessment person, which I am, but I really think that we need to privilege curriculum far greater than we do, in a far greater way than we do, possibly at the expense of some exam prep, where you know, for the final months of any student's GCSE or A-level experience, they are no longer learning, they are practicing tests. I know this both as a researcher and as a parent and as a school governor. So what I would like to see is a system where we can balance external examinations with a much broader and deeper curriculum offer.
Thanks, Tina. Jill?
Yeah, I mean, I do have sympathy for the idea of the broader curriculum. But I mean, I think I would just go back to my original point, really, which is that I think having a standardized measure of how students across the board are performing is really important. And I think that potentially not having that set of GCSE exams could diminish learning because of the consolidation point. That it's a way to help students to understand how much they've learned up to this point, and that can have additional impacts itself. So I'm struggling to see many reasons or positives for not having GCSEs.
Thanks, Tim.
I'll be brief. I mean, I think obviously GCSEs are tightly linked to the national curriculum. And in many ways, we have a very loosely stated Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 national curriculum in terms of the programs of study, because we have GCSE. If we didn't have GCSE, I think it's almost inevitable that the programs of study for the national curriculum for Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 would be made much more substantial. And by international standards, we have an impressive national curriculum in terms of its breadth and its depth. And so I think it's kind of moving things around a bit and not really affecting major change. And that kind of major change often is very disruptive for the system. In terms of creativity, teamwork, development of social and personal aspects of individuals, look, I can take English literature GCSE and history GCSE and develop incredibly creative and engaging programs of learning with the outcome of higher GCSE grades. And the very best schools do exactly that. So these are often presented as contradictions by commentators, but they're really not. And Ofsted inspection reports of the highest achieving schools and highest attaining schools make this very, very clear. There's no contradiction or trade-off between these things.
Sure, thank you. I think those are interesting points actually that everyone raises. I think one of the biggest problems we face in discussions about assessment is a kind of these very dual arguments that it's either one or the other, and that's often what's happening in our public spaces. So I think it's very important for us to be able to have the discussions that we're having here. There's one I just have to ask Tina, actually, which is from Mark Piergos, who asks, functional skills, they do what they say on the tin. Why are they not available to all students?
I'm not quite sure why you're asking me this. I knew quite a lot about functional skills when they were first introduced, and by all accounts they have improved, which I certainly hope they have, because the original functional skills left a lot to be desired. I was under the impression that there was no blockage to taking functional skills. Certainly not for the post-16 students who may not have done as well on their GCSEs as they should, and who need to go on studying mathematics and English post-16. But I'm afraid I can't answer a question to which I'm not absolutely sure what the answer is. Tim, because he's at an exam board, might better know what the rules and regs are about functional skills. Sorry for dodging.
Yeah, given the specificity of that question.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I might be out of date, Tina, too, because I haven't looked at the precise funding regulations at the moment. But essentially, a school can elect to use a qualification if it's a nationally recognised qualification. That if it's an academy or a state-funded school, if a qualification is recognised by Ofqual and is included on the DFE listings, then it can be used by a school.
And I believe functional skills are.
Yes, they are.
Yeah. So, yes.
Okay. I thought I'd throw that one out there. Okay, so we have a few questions to do with other jurisdictions that are overhauling their system. So, for example, recently Wales has gone through a system, of overhauling their GCSE examinations, and in particular focusing on that more on vocational skills. And I think we haven't really touched much on vocational skills this evening. And of course, that is a big part of this debate. There are students who might not necessarily want to continue on to A levels after GCSEs and might prefer to begin to focus on a more vocational route. But again, I think generally a lot of the discourse around assessment, and certainly on national test outcomes, always comes back to GCSE and A-level qualifications. I wondered what the panel, and I think also one of the audience also is suggesting this, think about that emphasis, and could we do more to really focus and talk more about the efficacy of vocational qualifications too? Sorry, I should choose someone, shouldn't I? Dennis, please.
Well, once again, my experience of the outside world stresses the importance of vocational skills in the round. So to my mind, we're back to what should the curriculum be, and how do you make the curriculum most fit for purpose, both for individual development and for equipping people for the wider world, whatever that might be. So in general, that's a good thing to look into. That's it from me. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dennis. Tina?
So I think some of this boils down to the way subjects are taught, because I'm going to go back to what I could be accused of being very traditional, but I do think that young people between the ages of 14 and 16 deserve a broad curriculum that includes subjects such as history, well taught in a creative way, where, I mean, part of the perverse incentive around qualifications is it narrows the way curriculum is offered to be a lot of exam prep. Now, there is absolutely room for vocational subjects in the Key Stage 4 curriculum, but I would hate to deny our young people the opportunity to study a broad range of subjects that will allow them to be responsible citizens in later life.
Okay, thank you. I'm not purposefully excluding you, Jill and Tim, but there's a few other questions here, and one that I'd certainly like to put to Tim and Jill, which relates to, again, it's more to do with the ethical issues here of the fairness of students, particularly in smaller secondary schools who perhaps don't get the opportunity to study the same breadth of curriculum that might be on offer in larger secondary schools. Can we account for this going forward? Is this something that we should be looking at in a national context in terms of fairness and access to different curriculum subjects?
Jill, do you want to dive in? Jill, do you want to dive in, or shall I go?
You go first.
Okay, so what, again, dealing with the history of education, I'm going to say something very general and true, which is that we have the most diverse education system in the world. Okay, now you can talk about the states, but the state doesn't have a national, and the states does not have a national education system. And when I look at I've visited hundreds of education systems and localities and municipalities. England has the most diverse system in the world. We have big, small schools, different ages of transition, different composition, different local education markets in terms of competition and so on. And it is a fantastically difficult system to actually get improvement. And it's a very difficult one for policymakers to grapple with. We've got a historical legacy all over the place. What we need, we won't change this issue of small schools in some localities quickly. What we have to understand is how to use data to understand what is happening to children in particular places, and offer special support if they are suffering from certain forms of deprivation, including curriculum narrowing. But many of these problems of equality, equity, and attainment derive from this extraordinary diversity, which is historical legacy in this country.
Thanks, Tim. Do you want to add anything, Jill?
Not really, except it's not really an area I'm that familiar with, except that, yeah, I definitely agree with Tim on that point.
Okay, thank you. We're coming up towards the end, but there's one terrific question here, which I think I would like everyone to comment on here from Ruth Lupton, who says, how do we get a sensible, informed political debate on this? Because of course, assessment is a very political topic. Would the panelists be in favour of an independent commission of any kind? I'll come back to you, Jill.
Yeah, I think that I would. I think that sounds like quite a good idea. I think there is a lot of controversy in this area, and I think that this is something that's really exploded in the past year, what with the cancellation of exams and so on. So yeah, I think I would be in favour of that.
Okay, Tim?
I think stability is an asset because it allows teachers to build up practice. It allows institutions to consolidate things and evaluate things and improve things incrementally in an appropriate way. So I argue very, very strongly against inappropriate cycles of change, which are too quick, and recognizing that when people say you've got to take education out of politics, education is politics. It's about the access to knowledge, and knowledge determines the shape of society. But we can certainly take it out of the political cycle, that's for sure, because the cycle of improvement is much greater, much longer than the political cycle. We should keep education under review, and now we've got a great history of doing great policy, education, the Education Act of 44, the Welfare Acts and so on, but now we've got an opportunity for much more democratic participation and transparency when we come to review important aspects of our society like education systems. So I think we can do the very best in terms of public policy formation in England.
Great, thank you. Tina?
So I have to point out that the Education Select Committee does do quite a lot of work in this area, and I think we could pay a whole lot more attention to the kinds of things that are coming out of the Education Select Committee. I would be fine with an independent commission as long as I'm on it.
Good answer. Dennis.
I think this is the big question. A minister who actually was decisive in a particular way will take decisions in a particular way, as Michael Gove did a decade ago. On the other hand, a minister who has his head in the sand or whatever will do nothing. So how do you influence politics is the big question. Would an independent commission have any clout? Who knows? This is the big question, and I'm afraid I despair about it.
Yeah, well, that's goodness, a bombshell to end on. And for those of you who are fans of social media, our Twitter feed has been quite busy this evening, and 40% of people are still in favour of hanging on to GCSEs. So I would like to say a big thank you to our panellists, to Tina Isaacs, Jill Winus, Tim Oates and Dennis Sherwood. And thank you to all of you for joining us here tonight at UCL Institute of Education. Thanks very much. Have a good evening.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, University College London.